Hello everybody, welcome back to C&S Corvettes in beautiful sunny Sarasota, Florida. It's your Corvette buddy Lyle here to talk to you about more interesting, exciting, and hopefully helpful Corvette stuff. Today, I'm going to review with you some of the parts that are on the C&S Corvette's Wall of Shame. I don't know how many of you follow Formula One racing, but Enzo Ferrari, back in the 50s and 60s, had the premier racing team in Formula One. And on the shelf in his office, he had all of these different parts that had failed in a race and cost him victory. Each one of them had a tag on it with a name, a date, and who made the part. And every last one of those parts represented an employee that no longer worked for him because you didn't cost Enzo a victory. Our Wall of Shame's a little different. Our Wall of Shame is parts that failed when they shouldn't, or oftentimes they are parts that have failed that I keep on the shelf as a visual aid when I'm explaining to car owners what is happening with their car. So today I'm going to review a few of the parts on the C&S Wall of Shame, just like I would if you were sitting at my desk and we were talking about your car. First up is a part that if you watch this channel, you're probably pretty familiar with. C5 C6 harmonic balancer. This one I've had by my desk for the better part of a decade because it perfectly illustrates the failure on these units. So, as you look at this, you can see that there is an inner hub. There's a little blank space here that should be filled with a vulcanized rubber strip, and outside is the weighted outer ring. The problem is, as that rubber starts to go bad, this outer ring starts to wobble on this inner ring, and in worst cases can even rotate, which means engine turning, belts not turning. Or in worst case scenario, these can walk backward into your engine, or it can walk forward into your power steering rack, and then, well, you can imagine what goes on after that. Another part on our Wall of Shame, and another common failure on Corvettes, specifically C5s, is the clutch master cylinder. It's plastic bodied, made by a company called Luke for GM. And if you ever have the problem with your C5 manual where the clutch pedal sticks to the floor and you have to use your toe to pick it back up, the reason why is inside this cylinder is this piston with two seals. Over time, these seals can start to break down, or you get clutch fluid in there that becomes so dirty, it starts scoring and cutting the sides of that rubber. And now instead of this pressing fluid like it should, the fluid flows past those seals, and that's why your pedal gets stuck to the floor. The next part is actually from our C&S Corvette's track car that Steve drives at Sebring during track days. The last track day we did a few months ago, the car started smoking a little bit, and not in a good way. So when we cut the weekend short, we brought the car home and gave it to Blake. Blake dug into it and found out that we had a piston problem. This piston. Now you're saying, Lyle, that looks okay. It looks like a piston. It did. Uh-oh. You see this? A piece of the piston chipped off and then got between it and a valve and just basically destroyed this piston. You can see this part is missing here and a bunch of gouges up here. And all of a sudden, coolant and oil started bypassing the piston ring. So, because the piston ring got compromised. Hopefully this is nothing that ever happens to your car, and hopefully it never happens to our car again, but it's a good teaching tool to show what can happen if things get too hot or if LS6 piston can fail. Another usual suspect here on the C&S Corvettes channel is we talk about torque tubes and torque tube couplers in the C5, C6, and C7. Now, a coupler is basically a round rubber disc that's been reinforced inside with Kevlar fibers and has 6 bolt holes in it. And the input shaft from the engine bolts up to a coupler, which then bolts to the drive shaft, which then bolts up to another coupler, which bolts up to a bearing assembly at the back, all inside that torque tube. C7s in particular have a problem, and that is the rubber compound they used in their couplers doesn't tend to kind of shrink and crack and dry up with age like the C5 and C6s did. They tend to do this. They end up just turning into this fibrous mass, and you start hearing a lot of rattling and everything from under the car. This is a failed coupler, but this is actually not a horribly failed coupler. That is. This is when we take the drive shaft out of a C7 torque tube and just this mass of rubber shreds comes out with it, with a few loose metal pieces. And people have been driving that car for like a long time with it in that condition. So when you start hearing that, what sounds like an exhaust rattle under your car, you start feeling that vibration between 1800 and 2500 RPMs, this is what's happening. And we want to get to it before it gets to here, and certainly before it gets to here. Be warned. Staying with the torque tube theme, this is a bearing carrier and a coupler from a C5 that had been installed by a shop from out of state. The people brought their car down here on vacation and barely made it, made an emergency stop at our shop because of the racket they were hearing. Well, whatever shop did this ended up installing it incorrectly. So the entire drive shaft assembly was really, really compressed. And as you can see, this coupler, which is supposed to be flat, certainly isn't. And you can see the angles of these bolts is not good. Flange is broken bolt here, bent flange. This is another one that we pulled out and we're like, I didn't even know that could happen. So it can. This is an axle shaft from a C5 Z06 that a customer brought into us, okay? This is the part of the axle shaft that's supposed to go here. Now, the funny thing is, this gentleman brought this car into us on a flatbed because he had bought it after having been hit light in the left rear, replaced the quarter panel, replaced the inner fender, replaced the wheel, painted the car super nice. And once the car was done, he went out and did a celebratory smoky burnout. And all of a sudden heard this giant racket going on in the back. So he figured he'd blown up either his transmission or his differential. What he did was he sheared this part going into the wheel bearing completely off of the axle shaft assembly. How did that happen, Lyle? Well, this is the corner that got hit. So when this took that shock, it obviously cracked this assembly, but it didn't get replaced during the repairs. So when he super torqued it by doing that smoky burnout on fresh sticky tires, it just sheared this off. So good news for the customer was he didn't need a transmission. He didn't need a differential. All he needed was 2 new axle shafts. But this is a really good lesson in, if a car gets hit while it's being repaired, you need to look deep and make sure that nothing else got hurt. Because if it did, you can have catastrophic problems like this. Another usual suspect in C5 failures are the original factory sway bar links, which are basically like a black composite plastic. And the ball joints in them get really hard to move and they just fall apart with age. It wasn't a bad design, but it wasn't a design meant to last 20 plus years. It was designed to get out of the warranty period. When we replaced these, we replaced them with greasable full metal sway bar links that last pretty much the life of the car. These guys, not so much, but most people who, if they aren't familiar with suspension components, don't even know what that is. This is when you've got your sway bar at the back and your sway bar at the front. This is the link between the suspension and the sway bar, and that's why it's got 2 ball joints so it can move. But this is what happens as they age. And last but not least, we have another usual suspect for C5 and C6, specifically 03, 04 C5, and 05 through 13. Left-hand fuel pump assembly. Now, in their wisdom, as we've talked about on this channel in the past, GM decided that having the pumps accessible from the bottom of the tank like they were from 97 through 02 just wasn't a great idea. They wanted the pumps to go in from the top so to prevent any chance of leakage in the future. Okay, I get that. Problem is, you notice how yellow this is? You notice how kind of dingy it looks? Well, here's the problem. Plastic with age and heat gets brittle, and these pumps are famous for getting a small crack right here or right under here at this 90 degree. And when you go and fill your tank up, gas will percolate out of those cracks and then run down the side of the tank. Never enough to drip on the floor, but plenty to make your entire garage smell like a refinery. This is the culprit. Thankfully, these are pretty much available now from several different manufacturers. The bigger problem on your C5 or your C6 is the right-hand fuel pump on the passenger side is not. That's the one that actually regulates the fuel level between the two tanks. Those are not reproduced by anybody right now, so hopefully those do become available. But another teaching tool showing where these leaks occur on your fuel pump. So that was an overview of just a few of the items on the C&S wall of shame. Shame that they weren't taken care of earlier, shame that they weren't made better, shame that they failed in a weird way, but all of them have a value for teaching, which is why I hold on to them and keep them on a shelf next to my desk. I have more, and maybe if you guys like this, we'll do a second episode with more wall of shame parts. If you like this kind of information, put it in the comments below so that we know to make another one of these. Otherwise, we'll see you later in the week.